I'm curious to know what the porn connection is, because I'm sure I've noticed as somebody who's been advocating against pornography for quite a long time now, that what people will tell you is not only that porn is harmless, it's not bad, but a lot of people will say, it's actually good because these men would be raping way more. These men would be much worse if they didn't have porn as an outlet. How do you respond to that? And what is the porn connection in terms of things like sexual deviance and sexual abuse and these predators?
The porn connection is 100%. It all comes down to porn. You have no sex offending without pornography. Now, those such as James Cantor and others that are pro porn, that try to minimize porn, will say, well, there's always been sexual assault prior to porn. Correct, because that has to do with deviance. And I can describe what deviance is. Deviance is the issue. That's when life becomes inverted. That's when a man's mind becomes psychopathic. He'll never come back from that. That's when people, instead of loving people and using things, they morph through objectification and beyond power and control into deviance. That is about having a negative effect. That is about marring and scarring the soul. When a man becomes deviant, he can only get an erection when he knows he's having a negative impact upon his. You're no longer dealing with a normal person. You're dealing with a psychopath. How can I say that? The Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, dealing with sex offenders, if somebody has harmed a child, they get a secondary level of an evaluation. So we within the prison system will do an evaluation, a prison psych eval, focused on the sex offense. But then in Pennsylvania, and I'm going to assume many other states, the former Secretary of Corrections who made a change while I was employed by the PA, Department of Corrections, DOC. Jeffrey Beard was the head of corrections for Pennsylvania. He became hired on for the head of corrections for California. My guess is he took the same policies, he implemented those. That's why he was being recruited. Why did California recruit the head of corrections from Pennsylvania? Because Pennsylvania was the cutting edge, and my program was one of those model programs before a sea change within the administration happened, and then some negative things happened. And I actually had to blow the whistle on inmate abuse. Including I stood up for a trans inmate. So I'm not against anything. I'm very much for the protection of women and children. But here's the dirty little secret that nobody wants to have out there. And Judith Reisman, I give her credit. She and I became close friends before her death for the last 2 years of her life. Judith Reisman unmasked and uncovered the fraudulent work of Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey shifted. He was paid for, by the way, by the CIA and the Rockefeller Foundation. Very interesting. How do you change a culture? You impact their sex and sexuality. You loosen the mores. I'm not saying the US was perfect by any means, but I'll tell you what, with anybody, or just like with anybody, you give them, especially men, you give them permission to jettison their conscience, and that country is not long for the world. I mean, that country is going to go south very quickly. Why? Because deep within the heart of man, if allowed to be selfish, he will become a barbarian. You see it through world history.
Mm-hmm.
Men were designed to be chivalrous, but by nature they are selfish. And so if left to themselves, I tend to be fairly faith-based without a belief that someday I'm going to be called to give an account. That's the thing that will cause me to rethink my priorities. Well, left to ourselves, men become barbaric in one way or another. There's always been selfishness, and therefore sexuality has been used by men rather than other-oriented to build others up, meaning their spouse, their lifelong partner. It becomes self. And so the unfortunate trajectory for a guy left to himself in his selfishness is he will objectify the world. He's the center of the universe. He will objectify things. So instead of loving people and using things, he'll invert those. You start to allow that to happen with sexuality. Now you have a very dangerous combination. Deviance has always been with us throughout human history, meaning men have always been able to, once they degenerate, using their sexuality for harm. That's always been the case. But ever since pornography, Hugh Hefner, and the internet, there's no looking back. So ever since, what I'm saying is this, ever since the 80s, that's probably safe to say. So ever since the 80s, certainly ever since I started in the DOC, which was 2005, and I started to do a deep dive into all the records that I had access to, which were all the records. Regardless of which institution you're at, you're tapping in to a mainframe. So I started to do my own research. It really got underway in earnest in 2012 and culminated in 2015 for me. I wanted to find out, among other things, how many sex offenders, child sex offenders, were busted with pornography. And the answer is 100%. And then the other thing is this: how many sex offenders were deeply steeped in pornography prior to offending? So we have the population of all sex offenders and then the subpopulation of pedophiles. 100% of all sex offenses, you will find that prior to arrest, the man was deeply steeped in progressive porn for years. You have no sex offending now without pornography being involved. 100%.